Have you ever asked yourself how long you could fight for freedom, especially if you knew that it might cost you everything you had? Could you stand firm against injustice when your enemy isn't just the system, but it's despair itself? Nelson Mandela, didn't just face these questions. He asked and answered them on a long and hard journey that included 18 grueling years imprisoned on Robben Island. I've had the brutal privilege of standing in his cell, a cold concrete cage stripped of everything except hope, guided that day by a man who was imprisoned with Mandela and suffered alongside him. What a powerful reminder to me that true leadership isn't forged in comfort, but in the crucible of struggle. The conversation we're about to embark on in this episode will take us beyond the myths and into the marrow of Mandela's life, unpacking powerful lessons from an impressive and imperfect man who transformed bitterness into grace, captivity into a platform for unity, and relentless suffering into a rallying cry for reconciliation. If you're tired of comfortable cliches about leadership and courage, get ready for a raw confrontation with what it takes to really lead, not from the position of privilege, but from within the belly of oppression itself. Mandela's life doesn't just inspire, it challenges each of us to measure our resolve against his somewhat messy and monumental legacy. Hey, my friends, welcome back to the Uncommodified Podcast. I'm Tim Windsor, and today my guest, once again, is my great friend, Craig Minchin. Craig, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, as always, Tim. Good to see you.
And I always like to say, just not my great fan, but my leadership historian. That makes me feel so good that I got Craig, my leadership historian. And for those of you who have been part of this journey for a long time, you know that Craig and I have done podcasts together over the years about historic leaders and looking at things, because this is Craig's area of expertise and research. And then Craig went dark for so long on me. I couldn't find a guy. No, I could find him because he comes over for cigars and scotch to my house, but this was a long time in the making, which is kind of interesting. So we're going to talk about this because we've been talking about having this conversation for a long time. But of course, before we get into that, I do think that every Uncorked conversation, and surely every conversation that you and I, Craig, mostly have, does start with a wee drink, a wee dram some days. So what are you drinking today?
I am drinking some bourbon. I'm not sure if you can see the bottle there. It's called Penelope. It is
Penelope.
it is a straight bourbon whiskey from, of course, the state of Kentucky, and I'll be drinking that this evening with you.
Excellent, excellent. Well,
Like it.
you know what? I actually decided to get the bottle of the whiskey we shared the last time you were here because it's so
Great
drinkable.
stuff.
So this is an Indian
Yep.
fusion. It's called Fusion. Amrut is the name, and it's a fusion between Indian barley and Scottish barley, but not just any Scottish barley. My favorite Scottish barley, Isla Scottish barley, which means this is this unique taste between this Indian barley and this peated barley, and it's really drinkable. I loved it. Remember?
I absolutely loved it,
Oh,
and
I
I
don't
love
you?
learning new things
Oh,
because it's Scotch. It only
yeah.
comes from Scotland, right?
Oh, that's
Wow.
ooh, so good. I
Oh.
know it's all over the place. Now listen to this here. I love the sound. Listen. Oh, what a sound. Okay, I'm trying to pour this one now, right in front of the microphone. Listen. Boy, listen to the sound of that. All right, I got to put the lid on this because the other day I almost knocked a whole bottle of whiskey over when I was podcasting, so I don't want to do that. It was at the beginning, not near the end. At the beginning. Cheers to you, my friend. Mm. Oh yeah, very drinkable.
Mm.
How's your Kentucky straight bourbon?
I've never met a bourbon I don't like. So,
I know.
it is very, very smooth. Anyway, it's
I,
absolutely
I love
glorious.
it too. So, little factoid before we get into Nelson Mandela. So, a lot of people believe that for American whiskey to be called a bourbon, that it has to be made in Kentucky.
Mhm.
That's not true. Although I think almost 80 or 90% of bourbon still comes from Kentucky, partly because the water source is so pure. They have limestone, and the water is so pure that it is still the go-to place for bourbon, even though you can make bourbon other places. But Kentucky straight bourbon is the creme de la creme of the bourbon industry.
Glorious stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
glorious stuff.
Glorious place, glorious stuff. All right, listen, enough about whiskey.
Yeah,
Like a taco. We should do a whole podcast on whiskey. That'd be kind of fun.
we should actually.
We
Yeah.
should, and we should like drink all the during the whole thing and see what it sounds like at the end.
You know, that could just go in so many different directions, and yeah, it'd be
Okay.
unpredictable. That's
I'm
for sure.
signing up for that one day. We're gonna do that. That'll be a good one. Okay. All right. Now shenanigans. Back to the matter at hand. I am really glad that you come back on the show to have a chat, Craig, because I always love learning from you, and I know my listeners do. So you and I have been talking about having a chat about Nelson Mandela for probably a couple of years,
Years.
actually.
Yep. Yep.
And I had a privilege of spending a lot of time in Africa throughout some charity work that I did over the years and some leadership development work I did in Africa. And so, as I said, I had the privilege of being on Robben Island, and it was, man, it was a crazy experience. And the way they do the tours, as I mentioned, so the tours at Robben Island today are only conducted by former prisoners.
Mm.
So whoever is your tour guide spent time at Robben Island. It is so very, very powerful. It is a powerful experience, and it was a brutal place for sure. So let's talk about Mr. Mandela. So tell us a little bit about this man and why should his life and legacy, even though it's a bit messy, why should it be something that we would want to look to and be inspired by?
Sure. Sure. So you've focused on the just in the introduction, you focused on the part that he's probably most known for. Ironically enough, actually,
Mhm.
his time on Robben Island in prison, and we'll kind of get to that, but he certainly didn't start life off as a prisoner. He started his life off. I was born, I think, 1918. He started off his life in rural South Africa. Uh, I hope people know this. If they don't, it was very much an apartheid segregated state. His father was a polygamist, as was the custom of his tribe. So his father had four wives, which means Nelson was one of nine children.
Wow.
Um, his father died when he was nine, I believe. And because his father was an influential member of the community, Nelson and his mother and his siblings were taken in by the equivalent of the chief. And basically, I mean, although we wouldn't consider a privileged existence by our standards, it did give him the opportunity to go get educated, to have food on the table every night, water, I'm not sure running water, but clean drinking water. But education was really, really the big influence over his life, and that only came about as a result of the tribal chieftain. So in a way, in a way, Tim, he was actually almost raised as a prince
Interesting.
in a way.
Well, it's interesting because he has this moment of pain, obviously losing his father, but it does, from what you're saying, it changes as a bit of the trajectory maybe of his experience because now he's raised in a different place, and you I wonder if, and probably of course we have this folklore myth that grows around this, but I wonder if people start to see in this story start to see this thread or narrative of destiny in this kind of situation.
Yeah. So I started to, so part of my research, Tim, in whenever I get into any of the characters, I try and get as holistic a view of them as is possible. And with him, his life is such like on such a grand scale, it is, it's really really challenging. But what I started to kind of pinpoint was certain moments in his life around some of his hobbies or activities. So one of his hobbies when he was a young man and even into his early 20s, and just kind of think about this in the context of a man who's lived with segregation, who's lost his father at a young age. Yes, he's got some privilege, but it's certainly clear he's a step below everyone else. One of his hobbies was he became a boxer. So he was a heavyweight boxer, and that really lined up with, I say, his persona at the time. So Nelson Mandela was a scrapper of a guy. He was a scrapper. I thought when I started researching him, I was going to get into um, this folk hero, this like the monument of Nelson Mandela, and I found the man of Nelson Mandela instead. This guy who loved to duke it out in the ring, who was a fighter, a scrapper, who was quite prone to violence, didn't shy away from violence, and it's interesting because of course his life did not end in that mindset, but that's how he spent a good number of his years as a boxer before he kind of became Nelson Mandela as we know him.
Wow. So he's growing up in this environment. He's got a scrappy attitude. He's
Mhm.
fighting his way up like a lot of people, trying to
Yeah,
find his way. And so at some point his life begins to move
yeah,
in some different circles.
yeah. So he very quickly realized that there was a great career waiting for him. Obviously, he was a very intelligent man. He did go to a university that was well known for higher education, I guess you could say, specifically for the black population in South Africa. So anyway, his profession he went into, closest thing to boxing for him was law. So he became a lawyer. He figured, if I can't hit people in real life anymore, I'm going to duke it out with them in the courtroom. And so that's how he kind of entered into his professional life. He became, and he and his partner actually became, I think they started the first black-owned law firm, certainly in Johannesburg. It may have been all South Africa. And
Right.
so they saw a need for the black population to be represented, and so took off his boxing gloves, went into the courtroom, and started representing black and also white people in legal affairs.
That's interesting. I mean, I knew historically that he was a lawyer. I had no idea he was a boxer. So this
Yeah.
again, if you're listening in, I mean, the one thing I want to remind you listeners is that we don't pre-plan these conversations, so they find their way as we talk. And when Craig did this research, we haven't chatted at all about the things that have sort of highlighted for him and what he's going to highlight for us during this conversation. So I get to experience it as you do, listeners. And so that's interesting because there is like a common thread. It's this scrappy, fighter who wants to fighty. That's a terrible word. Fighty. No,
It works so for
we'll
uncommodified.
go
Such
fighter.
an uncommodified.
Scrappy fighter who then starts to realize that probably if he's going to duke it out with the system,
Yeah,
he better get some education, he better understand it, he better come at it differently, partly because I'm sure because he's black, so he's at a deficit already, and so now he puts himself a place where he can begin to make argument or understanding or defense in relationship to clear laws
yeah,
that would bring guidance and governance to a community.
yeah, yeah. it, his brilliance, it's like you know the other civil rights leader that you and I talked about way back, Martin Luther King Jr. Of course, you can see the parallels. His brilliance was he wasn't changing laws; he was actually showcasing the existing laws to South African society, saying that, hey, on paper, this is what you say, and you're not living up to it, and that became his weapon. Is actually, I think in this context, weapon of choice would be probably be very appropriate.
Okay, so he becomes a lawyer.
Yeah,
That's all happening, but then he begins to use his understanding of the law and he starts to turn it in on the system, which is in the parallel you're just drawing is very interesting because obviously, MLK Jr. did the same thing in relationship, for instance, to the Emancipation Proclamation, right? I think he described it in that amazing speech, in Washington, what we call the "I Have a Dream" speech. He likens the situation in America at the time that this check was written that ought to guarantee or give the freedom to Black Americans, which was the proclamation of freedom. And what he said is that the check when the black man and woman tried to cash the check, I think is the language he uses, that it was non-sufficient funds. There was nothing to draw on. But
yeah,
he's actually literally taking that language, that document, and he's setting it up and saying, "You promised us this, and you guys have never delivered."
correct, correct. Yeah, so
Wow.
it's a really strong parallel there. So so he pivots his legal knowledge, his education, um, and it's very clear he wants to get involved with civil affairs. I mean, that was really the elephant in the room. Like he wanted to kind of transform the society. And so he gets involved with the political party, the African National Congress. He doesn't found it. It was founded a long, long time ago. Because I think of his leadership skills, probably his eloquence, his knowledge of the law. He doesn't just become a member of the party. He actually starts to become a very influential voice of the party as they start to work out policy. Like, how are we going to get equality for all Africans, for all South Africans. So he becomes a voice, starts to raise his profile within the party, and it goes really, really well. Like, this would be just an awesome story. Um, he started off as a boxer, then he went to a lawyer, and then he became a terrorist. Uh, he was a saboteur. So once they tried, the peaceful negotiation, the peaceful, like, hey, we don't want to be superior, like, we want to be equal with you. And once the government just kind of kept shutting them down, harassing them, I guess the party just said, well, you know what? It's time for us to start our own militant wing. And Nelson, you're going to be the person to create the militant wing of the African National Congress. I think it's called the Spear of Africa, is what it translates to in English. And so he became a saboteur, and a non-soldier. He wasn't a soldier, but he was tasked with learning how to build an army, a militant army within the African
Wow.
National Congress.
What okay, this is the part of the story I'd never realized. Now this is where his story does obviously deviate from MLK's, but kind of there is a lot of similarities. But
For
when
sure.
you say saboteur, it's interesting. My wife and I watched a movie recently. It might have been on Netflix, but I can't remember. It might have been called Spy Sailor. So I forget. I'm going to bastardize the name. Doesn't matter. It's
Okay. Yeah.
about It's about, sorry, Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for those of you who know or don't know, was a Lutheran theologian and German, and ended up at odds with Hitler and the Nazis during the war, and ended up leaving the country and being in safety, but then returning because he felt he had a mission to do. And he also got wrapped up in trying in an assassination attempt of Hitler. And he ended up being tried in the end and technically losing his life on the conviction of being someone who was tried to assassinate Hitler.
Yeah. 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 So in his role as the head of the militant wing of the African National Congress, he actually went on a tour around Africa very covertly to all the other African nations, basically to fundraise, to get money for their cause. And he did it, I think, disguised as a chauffeur. Uh, yeah, so because he was known to the equivalent of the Secret Service, and so he went around Africa, um, getting money for the cause. And when he returned, a series of events, people were onto them, the government was onto him. He was arrested. Long story short, trials, back and forth. That is when he entered his next stage of his career in his life. So he went from boxer, lawyer, saboteur to prisoner. And that is what he's most known for. So he was, yeah, definitely charged for, I think it was maybe insurrection was the official. It's all legalese, but they had him. They had all the evidence that they needed, and he was guilty according to law, even if morally there was maybe some dubious motivation there.
It's interesting because when you look at this story so far, I mean, there's some redemptive qualities in it, but it seems a little bit nefarious overall so far. So
Yeah.
it's strange because we don't typically think of Mandela in these ways.
Yeah.
We see him in a very different way globally, and eventually we see him differently. Of course, everybody can change, and they can go through. There can be redemption, and there can be change of heart and mind. But so he ends up in prison now. So he spends, I think, if I recall, he spends a lot, like almost 30 years in prison. I know he spent 18
27 years.
years in Robben Island, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. 27 years in total in prison. So, Tim, as I was doing my research, I was thinking 27 years. Like, what was I doing 27 years ago? And you know what? I may as well just call it he spent a lifetime in prison, because that means you're missing your children. Um, now, I will say he was missing his wives, because he
Okay.
was a serial philanderer. But he missed the prime of his life. So 27 years, I'm just going to call a lifetime he spent in prison.
Wow. So he picked up the habits of his father.
Certainly did. Now he didn't. I will say this: he never. Yeah, it was never. officially married multiple people. It was more he was a cheater on the side. He was a serial cheater on the side. So I think he was officially married 3 times, maybe 4 times, and there's allegations of children and
Wow.
like I bet you weren't expecting this conversation to go this direction, but it's
No.
part of, I think, for me, um, part of understanding just the full picture of who he is.
Yeah, I mean, again, when you think of it historically, and it's easy looking back, obviously, to sanitize somebody's life, and that's the one thing that you and I have never done when we talk about historic leaders. There's this messy
Yeah.
part of their lives. I think we've often described it as there's this light interplay between light and darkness, and clearly there's a lot of gray to dark things going on in Mr. Mandela's life over the years. So how does in this journey now he's in Robben Island, he's been in prison. How does this start to change and take a different path to the Mandela that many of us now sort of think about when we think of him?
And this is why people focus on this part of his story so much, because those who have studied him know that, he went in certainly not free of accusation or of guilt, but he came out much, much different. And ironically enough, Tim, his 27, almost 30 years of being a prisoner are what actually changed him and turned him into the leader that he became known as. So, now the cell that he lived in.
Yeah.
He described it as if I lay on the floor, I could my head was touching
Yep.
one wall and my feet were touching the other. Does that sound about right?
100%. He was a rather tall man,
Yeah,
and that cell was excruciatingly small.
yeah,
I can remember a couple of things about that visit. One was just how absolutely small that cell was, which was just terrible. They would take the prisoners every day, they would take the prisoners out to the other side of the island where there was this brilliant white rock quarry. And what they would do, because they wanted to just demoralize them day after day, is they would make them dig a hole and dig all the rocks out one day. And then they would make them fill back in the hole they just dug with the same rocks the next day. And it was a repetitive cycle. And the rock on that side of the island, it's this white rock that has this almost glinting and almost diamond little bit fragments to it. And some men went blind from the reflection of the sun. It was like when we were there, it was a sunny day. When you got on that rock face, it's like you couldn't even, when you get it's sunny and you're squinting, you can't even sort of see because it's so bright. That's the way it was, and excruciatingly hot. It was a terrible, terrible place to be. And if I recall from what the gentleman said who was a prisoner with him, who was part of the ANC, by the way,
mm,
is that he said that the other part of it is the guards, it was a punishment for them.
yeah,
And so the guards that were sent to Robben Island were they themselves basically criminals.
yeah, yeah.
It was a brutal place.
So you mentioned a very interesting part of his mindset, okay, that I think evolved at Robben Island, actually, because you're right. The guards were miserable, by the way.
Mhm.
Not all of them. He does describe
Yeah,
like some that were, you would say, maybe not civil, but less miserable than
yeah,
the others.
yeah.
But they were overall miserable. Here's the mindset that I saw emerge through Robben Island. Um, he certainly wanted to free his fellow, the black population in South Africa to be equals with the rest of the population. So he knew there was a freedom work that was going on. I need to free my people. I want to be part of freeing my people. But with the guards, he actually also saw them as being enslaved themselves. So
Well,
it's I don't just want to free my people from, and make them equal. Actually, I'm here to free you as well because you yourself are enslaved to a wicked, wicked mindset. So although they were enemies in a very real sense, he was able to see, hey, I'm just here to free us, and I'm here to free you. And a really interesting and moving point, just to highlight that, Tim. I'm kind of getting ahead of the story, but I think while we're talking about his relationship with the guards, a very complicated relationship. When he was released, when he did become the president, the democratically elected president of South Africa, he actually invited those guards to his inauguration and he sat them in positions of honor.
Wow.
That kind of leads to I think what he's most known for. I found that incredibly moving. So he was able to see them equally as victimized as he himself. That
That's
makes him
amazing.
unique.
And Craig, I don't know if you came across this in your research or not, but the one other thing that this gentleman, and I wish I could remember his name, but I can't. One thing he told us, which was just fascinating, again, and it's connected to the guards. He mentioned to us that a lot of these guards one of the reasons why they were sent to Robben Island to be guards is that they had charges against them.
Yeah, yeah,
And Mandela, in a very, very, one, I think, smart way, but also in a compassionate way, he actually helped the guards because he was a lawyer. He helped the guards and wrote documents on their behalf
he did.
to try to help them in court. Is
Yeah,
is that correct?
that is absolutely correct. And
Oh,
so, um, and I should also say this: when Mandela went to prison, you said he was imprisoned with other people with the
yeah,
ANC. A lot of them were political prisoners there,
right.
and so they were, in a way, they were kind of comrades in arms and friends and whatnot. But yeah, their policy was, if someone treats us civilly, we will respond in kind. So we're not here to, piss off guards. That doesn't help us out at all. But yeah, he actually took up some of their cases, kind of helped unofficially kind of represent them in matters of law. So yeah, isn't that an interesting olive branch, by the way? And
That's just, yeah, it's just so very fascinating. I have to admit, when I went out to Robben Island, and it's a ways out,
yeah,
but I've also historically I've been to Alcatraz. So I've been to Alcatraz, the prison on Alcatraz Island, and I will say it's not as far out, obviously, in the bay off of San Francisco, but
yeah,
it has the same oppressively evil
yeah,
feeling to it. Like it now, Robben Island's bigger, so is a bigger area. But I remember going to Alcatraz years ago, and just the feeling you get. So, man, this has got to just mess with your psyche. It's got all these things, and how you'd ever find something good or redemptive in it. Frankly, I don't know. I don't know. I don't think I could.
yeah,
So he's there, and this is all happening, and he goes in there. He's this rough and ready saboteur.
yeah, yeah,
So when he recounts his journey or others do, when does this start? And he starts becoming maybe a little bit different the way he's going to look at the Garzas.
yeah,
When does this start, and how does it continue, and how does it take him into more of the area that we tend to see him?
yeah. So it starts off. It seems to start off kind of immediately in an odd way, Tim. Robin Island was like a community. Like it's hard to, fathom that. But he saw this. I think he saw Robin Island as almost a template or a prototype for what society could be. And so the ANC members there, the political prisoners, even though they weren't supposed to talk because there was obviously real concerns about, you know, them organizing, whatever jailbreaks or escapes. Not that there's anywhere you can go because you're on an island, but they operated as like a leadership team there. So they talked about like policies around, how do we interact with the guards? How do we protest? When do we protest? It's amazing, even in those conditions, he was very quick to talk about his legal rights, and he would lodge formal complaints to anyone that would listen. And because the law was the law, they had to listen. He put them in writing. He would quote the law back to them, like if they wanted to kind of punish him in a certain way or deprive him of clothing or food or social interaction. So he maintained. I would say the word that came to my mind, Tim, was steadfastness, like a trueness to himself. Like there was a trueness that kind of that didn't go away, regardless of the environment that he was in. And because he was surrounded with his fellow allies, again, they just kind of built this resiliency to themselves. And a weird, I'll throw it one weird fact about him. I told you his hobby at first was
Yeah.
boxing, which really lined up to his really scrappy nature. Like I just want to hit something or someone. His hobby in prison, after he'd served many years there, was actually gardening. So he went from boxer to gardener, and he talks about how the garden became a real symbol of life for him, and also lessons in patience and humility. As you try and coax these vegetables in this brutal soil, and it seemed that actually kind of represented a softening of some of those hard edges, but it didn't remove his steadfastness and his desire for true justice. So it's a combination of a whole bunch of things. You're
Yeah.
asking me a great question. I'm having trouble pinpointing what was the moment
Oh,
because there was
yeah.
just
Well,
so
you know what? Again, it's I guess maybe the frailty of my question is we think it's a moment, but in this case, it's not a moment.
yeah,
It's a season almost.
yeah,
And I think the other part of the story as you're talking about it is that it's clear that the prison is a place of teaching, humility, redemption. Something's happening in him.
yeah.
And that story, that narrative is a narrative that exists in so many different people's lives.
Mhm.
It's really, really fascinating. But typically, the prison is forced on a person in an unjust way or unjust way, but he deserved to be incarcerated because he was a saboteur.
Yeah.
And yet, still in the midst of that, he gets an opportunity to find something different. It's a very, very fascinating narrative.
It's it is a fascinating narrative, and somewhere it clicked for him. Um, I mean, they had very clever ways of getting news from the outside world. Okay, very clever ways, and then passing that news to each other. Um, but somehow it clicked to him that I'm actually more powerful in prison than I am outside in the real world. So there was almost like a training ground. And like I said, it's almost like I think they were trying to see this as a prototype
Yeah.
for can we change the society? If we can change this prison, we could change the society. But he actually refused at one point in time, this after I don't know how many decades now, but deep into his prison sentence, um, he was offered a chance at early release and he turned it down.
Huh.
And I don't know if I would have done that, but
Wow.
he turned it down, and I think that's the moment he kind of realized I'm actually more powerful as a symbol in here than I am out there. So yeah, prison was a real interesting proving ground for him.
So he's in prison. All this stuff is happening. The world's going on. How does he end up eventually? So again, if you're listening in and you're listening to this story, one thing I guess I'm hoping is you're hearing maybe a different part of the story that you would have, which you might have understood about Mr. Mandela, but you're also starting to see that the crucible that's forming him. And again, I think just as a point for all of us, there's times where we get imprisoned in our lives, metaphorically, more than likely, because of things we're not responsible for. And there's times, frankly, we get imprisoned or we get off-sided or whatever because of things we've done. But both times of being in prison hold opportunity for redemption and learning and humility to come, regardless of how you got there. And so I would just encourage you, whether you feel like you're in a bit of a prison of not of your own making, or maybe you're in a prison of your own making. Um, I guess it doesn't matter at the end of the day. You still could find something new and redemptive in it, and you could find a new way of looking at yourself and the world around you, like Mr. Mandela did, and as the world did eventually. So, how does he eventually get out of this hellhole called Robben Island,
Yeah,
find his way back to the mainland, and then move into this next season of the maybe the destiny of his leadership?
yeah. So timing is everything. I would say getting close. I don't even know how long his original sentence was. I believe his sentence was cut short though, and the main reason I would say was probably international pressure. Okay. Now I remember in high school,
Yeah,
I knew the name Nelson Mandela. And this is before the internet, this is before social media. We knew the story of apartheid in South Africa and that's just as a young teenager.
yeah.
The level of international pressure, sanctions on that country. I mean, my goodness, their rugby team, which factors in the story later, uh, rugby is sacred in South Africa, in particular to the white population. They weren't allowed to compete internationally. So, it's a whole bunch of international pressure. And then I would say we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about F.W. de Klerk, who was the white president of South Africa. So, sometimes there's a right time where personalities kind of connect together who would
Yeah.
be enemies in the past, but have somehow find an allyship. And so he was released in 1990 after 27 years in prison. By then, he truly had become a folk hero. Okay, truly, I mean, and not just in his country, beyond the country's boundaries as well. 1991, he was reelected to his head of the African National Congress. There was no other option. Like he just had
Yep.
such a presence on the global scene. And then in 1993, he and F.W. de Klerk, the white president, were both given the Nobel Peace Prize. So basically, it's a journey of reconciliation between these two people groups. And it wasn't just two people groups, there's more, but was well underway. And so he just kind of moved from his leadership in the prison to now his full platform on the outside. Tim, sorry to digress here. It does remind me a lot of the parallels of Winston Churchill's career,
Yep.
who spent most of his career in the wilderness, disliked, not trusted, resented, ineffective. He was just painting his little portraits in the countryside. But when his time came, it came.
Hmm. Well, and that's a really good reminder to all of us because, we have a sense again, we, I often say we draw such a ridiculously straight line from where we are to where we want to be, or from the problem we're trying to solve to its solution. We just draw this straight line. And none of these men or women's lives who were these great leaders, we've talked about men, we've talked about women over the years, and we've talked about leaders. They're, it's just not a straight path. Of course, it's not for any of us. And sometimes I think the problem is when it's not a straight path, we can get lost in it and think there's something wrong, but that's just the way life is. There are no straight rivers. There's no path that just goes from A to B just simply. So he ends up getting elected eventually.
Yep.
Who's and so then now he's in power. So now
Now he's in power.
this is a turn. This is a massive turn.
Tim,
He's now the guy.
he was once the prisoner of the state.
Yeah,
Now he's the head of state.
yeah,
Talk about a turnaround. Yeah,
crazy.
he is now in power.
So now he can do whatever he wants to do now. I mean, he can and he can't. It's a democratic country, but
Yeah,
he could do lots of different things. So you alluded to the fact that he takes a unique approach somehow
yeah,
and doesn't carry this thing around uh, with him to punish his oppressors.
yeah. And I'd say, I said Robben Island is probably what he's most known for, and it certainly is. It's his legacy that we're about to kind of move into that I think, which I find to be the most uh, moving, I
Yep.
guess. Um, so after decades of imprisonment, and he gets elected, he gets that power. He decides that there's too many examples of the oppressed getting liberated and then becoming the oppressor and seeking vengeance. And he charted a new path forward. And so the first thing he did, to we'll call them political enemies, the oppressors, is he made one of like he insisted on bringing them into his cabinet. So I'm now in power. I don't just want it to be my people. I want you in here as well. So he brought his political adversaries into the cabinet in positions of influence, including F.W. de Klerk, who was the president to help facilitate the end of apartheid. He was his vice president. So he taught his real legacy is he was able, his last role was, I think, forgiver. He was able not just to forgive the guards, and the system, but he was also able to model a path forward for the rest of the population. And I think that
Wow.
is truly, truly unique. That's probably what he's known for. and upheld for. That's why there's monuments of him,
Wow.
outside Westminster. That's why there's monuments, and that's why roads are named
Yeah.
after him. Like it's that ability to somehow forgive and see your former enemies as allies, and I find that incredibly challenging and moving.
Yeah, that is challenging because you think you've got all that power now and you can do, I mean, again, he could have easily had these people charged, he could have had them
Yep.
in prison. I hate to say, I mean, not to get offside with some of my listeners, but maybe modern leaders could take a lesson from this in the world and maybe even in North America about how, yeah, you know what, we get treated wrongly, but how we respond when we get in or back in power says a
Yeah,
lot.
sure does.
So it's really interesting because he probably would have felt justified. He would have had every right. And I think it goes back to this, when we think of vengeance, or revenge, a
Yeah.
better word, I think of, the Shakespearean play where we're talking about the pound of flesh, which is a really interesting. I think it might be Othello actually, where this comes from. Could be wrong in the play, but I think so. And it's this idea that you're going to you're going to get your revenge. And in the play, the one who's harmed has an opportunity to take revenge or get a pound of flesh from the person who harmed them. But the way it was going to work is they would get one strike with their sword, and then they would measure the flesh they cut off them.
Yeah.
And if it was not equal to exactly a pound, then the same punishment would be extracted on them. And it's a
Yeah.
really interesting. I mean, I love Shakespeare, but think about that, because this is the problem is that you just never get a pound.
Uh,
You just you also can't, you also can't walk free yourself if the rest of your life is wielding a sword to get revenge. You are so bound up to the past that you can't actually be free.
yeah. Yeah.
And again, if you're listening in, maybe that's the thing you got to ask yourself. I mean, you got some people in your life maybe that have harmed you, done you wrong in massive ways. But the question is, what does it mean to get a pound of flesh, and will it be too much? And could you walk in a different spirit, in clearly in which Mr. Mandela walks? It's a challenge to all of us. I mean, and to invite your enemies into your cabinet, it it's ridiculous, really, when you think about it.
It's well said. And that's, I think, again, that's what I find the most challenging and moving about his story. Um, there's when he did take office, uh, he focused obviously on the hard business of government. The same thing that every government focuses on: how do we run our country? But he really obviously put a lot of focus on reconciliation, recognizing that there was a lot of deep, deep, deep pain, hatred, contempt, and that if the country was to move forward as a nation and also as individuals, they needed to address that. So he set up, with another one of my heroes, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the
Mhm.
Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that basically offered amnesty for anyone who committed crimes under certain criteria, like kind of apartheid era crimes. If you just kind of come, confess, tell everything, you'll be granted amnesty. There's some nuances to
Yeah.
that, of course. Um, but that was, I mean, I've seen clips of it, by the way. I've seen testimonials of it. It was all very public. It's horrible to watch, because they would demonstrate. Some of the guards, police officers, Secret Service, military officers would demonstrate in court what they would do, to people that they caught. It's painful to watch, but the level of courage and conviction that he had to say this is a necessary pain we have to go through collectively, as a group. Um,
Wow, that's interesting. And Craig, as you say that, it's an interesting thing about forgiveness, is even as we're talking about this and the conversation sort of dances into this. So, think about the natural, it's sort of a knee-jerk reaction sometimes. Somebody's done something that offends you, they realize it and they want to apologize and they say, "I'm sorry." And we say, "Oh, no, no, you don't, it's no big deal." Or, "You don't have, no, no, you don't have to say that." but actually they do have to say it and we have to receive it,
Yeah.
like
Yes. Absolutely.
acknowledging it. And
Absolutely.
then, so forgiveness, to truly forgive and move on, it's not about forgetting because you can't forget, but it is actually about becoming awakened and acknowledging it, not forgetting it, acknowledging it, bringing it up in front and owning it, and then choosing in the light of being fully awake to it, to choose to say, I forgive you, let's move on. That is really, really ridiculously hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
hard. That's hard stuff.
It's hard stuff, and and that's why we talk about him, because I think he truly was so unique in that regards of not just changing a country, but changing himself.
Wow.
And there's one anecdote, if you don't mind, I wanted to kind of
Yeah.
share from his story, and um, I'm going to share this because you can see it on YouTube. It's a very very moving clip. 1995 World Rugby Championship, and I told you rugby was very sacred to South Africans, okay, but only to half of the population. Okay, it was very much a symbol of apartheid. Okay, that green uniform, they call it the Springbok uniform, was very much a symbol of apartheid. And so, white players, white coaching staff, white, like it's just so the black population rightfully saw that as almost like a hateful thing. The existence of rugby in South Africa was almost a sign of just hate. Um, but in the final match on South African soil, after they'd been exiled for not being allowed to compete for several years, the team actually won. And there's a beautiful moment. I just recommend people take a look at it, where Nelson Mandela, dressed, and listen to this, dressed in the rugby uniform, the
Uh,
symbol of apartheid, with the green shirt, shaking hands of the captain, saying, "Thank you for what you've done for our country." And I think that is so moving, because it just represents, obviously, he had a good sense for symbolism, but it just represents the humility and the commitment. And you can see the player saying, "Thank you for what you've done for our country." Like, it's incredibly moving. I know, I heard one fan say, "When I saw Nelson Mandela and the captain of the rugby team shaking hands, I knew our country was going to be okay." And
wow.
I only bring that up because I just think it's such good. It's good for the soul. It's
Yeah.
good for the soul to see demonstrations of radical love and forgiveness in action.
Wow. It's powerful. So, listeners, you know that when Craig and I dive into these things, we're seeing lessons maybe for leaders, and maybe if you're a leader, you see some leadership lessons in here. If you're just a human, you're seeing some human lessons in here
Yeah,
about suffering and pain and redemption and revenge and forgiveness and what it means to actually act in different ways to the way you've known all your life. Craig, it's interesting. I think I was in an airport recently. I was coming back from a business trip and I was in an airport lounge, and there was an older gentleman sitting at the table just across from me or next to me. And I've been in South Africa enough and in Africa enough that you know, sometimes people mistake South African accents for other parts of the world, like
sure. Yeah, yeah.
Australian, etc. I can usually pick them out, and I mentioned to him, and I said, "Sounds like you're from South Africa," and he said, "Yes." And he was an older gentleman, and we got into an very interesting conversation. He was on the way back, his way back. He's American now. He's on his way back to South Africa because his mom was ill. And it was interesting because he just out of the blue started talking about how great a man Nelson Mandela was. He also said, which is interesting, he said, I think if Nelson Mandela was alive today, he would be very sad
Yeah, very
about
much so.
where we are today.
Yeah, very much so.
And, it's just interesting, but and he was a white South African,
Yeah,
obviously quite well off. And yet, the way he talked about Mandela and the way he talked about what Mandela did and how he responded, you could still see that it had a deep emotional and psychological and practical application and effect in this man's life. He was probably in his early 70s, white, South African living in the States. And so I just remember leaving that conversation thinking, wow, what a rippling effect. Like the legacy of Mandela and the impact. And yes, he was a messy character like we all are. And I think that's the other part of these stories is, we're, only in fairy tales and folklore and reimagined history, which is sort of fake news. Are all of these leaders pristine and they never did anything wrong? But Mandela's a complicated man like all these people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet he is trying to figure out what it looks like. And I think the quintessential piece to the story as you're talking about it is, it's one thing about who you are when you have no power. It's another thing when you have all the power. I mean, that is the measure because, some of us rail against lots of things, but we don't have the power. But the question here is if you get the power, then who are you? And I think that's a good question for all of us to consider, whether we're in leadership or in our families. It's not who you are when you feel powerless. It's who you are and how you treat people when you have all the power. That is a really fascinating sort of story within this. And it's a challenge because, man, oh man, I think what do they say about power? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I suppose in this case, that's not quite the truth.
Yeah. 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 Power certainly, I think, reveals what's really in there within us.
Yeah.
And um, I think it probably revealed, like, I wonder what, I wonder what a young boxer Nelson Mandela would do if he was in power at that age
Yeah.
versus the post Robben Island Nelson Mandela did.
Yeah.
And I think he would have had two different expressions of power,
I
probably.
totally agree. Yeah.
I
And you can
probably
see,
would
yeah, and you can see the wisdom that grew in his life over time. I once heard somebody say, wisdom is what you learn after you think you know it all.
have. That's great.
And yeah,
I love
wisdom
it.
is what you learn after you
Yeah,
think you know it all. And
yeah,
so you see maybe a measure of wisdom come. And again, if you're listening in, I don't know how you ought to apply this conversation. That's up to you. But I will say to you listeners that I think some of us have stories in our life where we've been wronged by others or felt wronged, and then we get offsided in prison, or we've done something ourselves and we've been offsided. Don't lose hope in the midst of it. There is still opportunity. There's legacy still to be written. It is not the absence of difficulty and frankly fucking up that makes you destined for greatness. It more than likely is the presence of that. And then what you do with that, and then what you do as you get on the other side of that, that's probably the bigger thing. So, Craig, listen, I'm going to give you the last word on this. So, you've been studying Mandela, you've been diving in. I imagine you're going to eventually, if you haven't already, you're going to write something and it's going to get on your website, which I think is
yeah,
historyunfurled.com.
yeah.
So, at the end of all this research, which isn't just clinical or scientific in nature, if there was one thing that you could say that sort of you take from this narrative that you think is an important lesson or idea for you to take and put into Craig Minchin's life, what is it?
The story isn't over. There's more chapters yet to be written about your life.
Hmm.
Very, very, it's that's it. I go back um to the day in and day at night of him sleeping on that cold floor, wondering if this is it. And for me, um, I can't identify living in a real prison, but I can identify with wondering, like, is this it? Is this referencing my own kind of life and experiences? And that's what I take away from him. That there are still more chapters to be written, and they're pretty exciting.
Absolutely. A great way to wrap things up. Craig, thank you again for your time and thank you for the countless hours, many, many hours, possibly hundreds of hours
Thank
that
you.
you put into researching people's lives, learning lessons and bringing them back to people now. It's such a great gift. And I appreciate this is something that's important to you, and you have a passion for it, because I think it is so important. But I also appreciate that you don't whitewash the
Mhm.
historic figures that we're talking about. Because I think that's a problem. History, unfortunately, when we look back in history, sometimes we have a way of eradicating all the bad, and then the narrative teller tells it in a way that's only good for them. I like the fact that we have biographies that don't do that. I like the fact that you are a researcher that is always looking into the reality, not just the myth, not the myth, but the true reality of a person's lives, and not needing to shy away from it to find lessons that are beneficial. And again, if you listened in for a reason. I always say that. Thanks for joining us. Do me a favor, as you contemplate Mr. Mandela's life, maybe do some more research. Just ask yourself, what does this mean to you? And as you uncork it in your life, let Craig and I know what you're doing. You can email me at tim@uncommodified.com, or you can DM me. You can find Craig Minchin on social media. That's Minchin. Got it right?
All right.
And it is historyunfurled.com. Craig, thanks for your time. Have a great day. Cheers.